Why is it so hard to do the right thing? Philosophers have been asking this question for a very long time. Plato thought that people did the wrong thing only out of ignorance. This view was shared by Immanuel Kant, a very influential German philosopher. Buddhists offer a similar answer, though their idea of what we have to know to do the right thing is more complex than Plato's and Kant's view. Aristotle had a more complex view. He thought that misconduct was either a product of ignorance, weak will, or malice. Ignorance can take two forms. We can be ignorant about what is right or wrong, or we can be ignorant about whether a particular thing is in the category we identify as right or wrong. For example, someone may tell a lie because they do not understand that lying is wrong. This is an example of ignorance of the first kind. But one may also tell a lie when they just bend the truth a little, perhaps to avoid hurting someone's feelings. In this case, they do not see their act as telling a lie, but as avoiding hurt feelings. The discussions in this class should help you dispel ignorance of both kinds. Weakness of will. A person with a weak will wants to do the right thing, but they have desires that conflict with this. Some of the things that conflict with our desire to do the right thing are our desire to gain something for ourselves, our desire for approval, or our fear of disapproval or punishment. Often we rationalize our behavior in these cases. Everyone else is doing it. I'm not powerful enough to really make a difference. I'm a nice person, so this can't really be that bad. Being a good friend means looking the other way. A more damaging kind of rationalizing is denial. We deny that we are doing anything wrong. We blame our victims. We say that the world just isn't fair. We say it's not our fault. We point out that there are people who are much worse than we are. We claim we're only doing what we are told. We blame our parents, our therapist, our spouse, our children. Jean-Paul Sartre, a famous French philosopher who was one of the founders of existentialism, described this kind of a person as lacking authenticity. In both kinds of rationalizing, we are trying to deny our moral responsibility. We feel the need to rationalize because we are uncomfortable with our actions. Malice is a different thing altogether. A person of malice does the wrong thing simply because they want to do wrong. They realize that what they are doing is wrong and want to do it because it is wrong. This is true evil, and luckily it is not something that we see very often. A final cause of personal wrongdoing is a failure of empathy. 18th century British philosophers like David Hume, Francis Hutcheson, Lord Shaftesbury, and Adam Smith thought morality was primarily a function of having the right kind of sentiments. Many contemporary philosophers describe care as the central sentiment, and we'll discuss this view later. Moral psychologists like Martin Hoffman describe the ways that empathy can fail us. Ordinarily, empathy is a very powerful motive to help others. Hoffman claims that empathy is part of our evolutionary heritage and is present even in newborns. In the normal course of moral development, one becomes more able to figure out how others are feeling and how to respond appropriately. But it can sometimes let us down. Hoffman describes how we can blame the victim to reduce our desire to help. We can sometimes become so overwhelmed that we begin to be much more attentive to relieving our own distress rather than the distress of others. It can also be a cause of wrongdoing. Hoffman describes what he calls familiarity and here and now bias. It is natural to feel more empathy for those we are close to or those with whom we can identify, but it can sometimes cause us to neglect our other duties. Humans are creatures of habit, and our actions today influence the person we will become tomorrow. If we wallow in ignorance, we will become less and less sensitive to the moral dimension of life. If we rationalize our behavior, we will find it easier to give in to our desires rather than our sense of what's right. If we think of ourselves as members of a special privileged group, we will find it easier and easier to dismiss the needs and perspectives of people who are not like us. Life is a journey. You have to decide what road to take, the road to virtue and integrity, or the road to selfishness and irresponsibility. If you're still listening, we're assuming you are interested in the road to integrity. How then can you guard against misconduct? First, banish ignorance. Pay attention to the moral dimension of life. Come to understand what you think is right and wrong, and why you think this. Be open to different perspectives while maintaining your commitment to living a good life. See how principles apply in practice. Second, work on your weakness of will. Fear is a powerful barrier to doing what you think is right. We think of ourselves as little fish swimming out there in the shark tank. But the world is not an aquarium, and you are not just a little fish. You're a growing fish swimming in the ocean, and your actions will reconfigure your world. Ask yourself what kind of a world you want to swim in and make it so. Cultivate a sense of pride in doing what you think is right. The more you cultivate integrity, the easier it will become. Be aware of all the excuses we use for not doing the right thing. Everyone else is doing it. I'm not powerful enough to really make a difference. I'm a nice person, so this can't be really bad. Being a good friend means looking the other way. I'm not doing anything wrong. He had it coming. The world just isn't fair. It's not our fault. There are people who are much worse than I am. I'm only doing what I was told. Look yourself in the mirror every morning and try to be honest. Take responsibility for your behavior. Ask yourself what you would do if this were the last day of your life. Cultivate your ability to empathize with others. Educate yourself about what is going on in your family, among your friends, in your community, your workplace, your society, and the world. Be sensitive to the concerns of those near and dear to you, but not at the cost of being indifferent to everyone else. And now, the causes and cures of group misconduct. We do not exist as isolated individuals. We live and work and play in social groups, and our actions, both right and wrong, are done in a social context. For this reason, we need to look at group misconduct. We believe that collective misconduct, whether it occurs in corporations, non-profits, or in political organizations, has multiple causes, and in this lecture we will look at some of these causes. Since a person of integrity is not content to place blame, but is committed to working towards solutions, we will also look at a number of possible cures. I begin with the causes. Some have argued that the system is basically fine and that a few bad apples have spoiled the environment for the rest of us. Though some people are comfortable explaining misconduct in terms of a few individuals, we think that this view is not supported by the evidence. We are not denying that there are evil people. Hitler is an example that is widely cited here, but luckily people like Hitler are rare. Though we do not dispute the claim that there are and have been throughout history people of great evil, we think that far more evil is done by basically decent people going along and looking the other way. How often have you heard people say, "Everyone else is doing it. I'm only one person. I can't make a difference. I try not to involve myself. I can't afford to complain. I need this job." Well, they probably know better than I do. This is what it takes to get ahead. Morality is not part of my job description. If I don't do it, someone else will. As long as my accountant, my lawyer, my boss thinks it's legal, it must be okay. Hey, I was only doing what I was told. Another problem is narrow focus, and there are different ways to do this. One is a primary focus on insiders. This is particularly relevant to the case of for-profit corporations, but it occurs in many organizations. Organizations focus on their primary mission and their own membership, and sometimes forget that their actions affect many others outside this circle. In the case of corporations, some have argued that they have no obligations but simply exist as profit-making machines. This is a view with serious implications given the power that multinational corporations wield in today's world, so we will return to this later. Another problem, primary focus on the short term. Another part of the story here is that emphasis on short-term gain is often to the detriment of long-term gain. Lots of things look reasonable when we consider only the consequences in the short term. That ice cream sundae looks great until we think about the extra weight and effect on our health. Falling into bed without flossing your teeth looks reasonable when you're really tired, but it's knowing that flossing is required to keep your mouth in good repair for the long haul that makes you put in the effort to floss. Organizations can suffer from the same short-sightedness. Corporations have another reason for the emphasis on the short term. The wave of corporate takeovers created a reasonable focus on stock prices. Undervalued stock made companies ripe for takeover. While there are good consequences for many takeovers, such as putting constraints on incompetent management, this has often resulted in too much emphasis on the short term. Another problem is failure of leadership. Sometimes we think of leadership in terms of position and power, but having a position of power and responsibility does not automatically make you a leader. Regardless of our power or position, we are all leaders when we are willing to stand up and be counted. Cynthia Cooper changed the entire course of WorldCom and corporate oversight in the United States when she went against the express wishes of her bosses and detected the largest accounting fraud in U.S. history. Scott Sullivan, WorldCom's former chief financial officer and Cooper's boss, failed at leadership when he ignored his responsibility to WorldCom's shareholders in favor of lining his own pockets. Sullivan's inaction fueled Cooper's search for WorldCom's financial misdeed. Cooper inspired her small team of Gene Morris and Glynn Smith to a heroic and frightening effort that ultimately brought the massive fraud to light. Another problem is the dilution of personal responsibility in groups. Many people have pointed out that personal responsibility can often be lost in groups. Consider how often you've passed someone who is pulled over on the side of the road with car trouble. It is easy to rationalize that someone else will pull over. Corporations add another layer of complication to the story of diluted personal responsibility in group settings, because corporations are set up to assign legal responsibility to the corporation itself instead of to its members. In addition to corporations, there are other complex organizations in which the individual members are often not sure of their impact or power to effect change. In this kind of a culture, "someone else will do it" is a common refrain. People often worry about rocking the boat and endangering their careers and even their jobs. They tell themselves that they couldn't really make a difference anyway, but they are wrong. Colleen Rowley was an FBI employee 2.5 years from retirement who was her family's sole breadwinner. She wasn't in a position of great authority. She was a mid-level lawyer in a Midwest field office. Nevertheless, her revelations to then FBI Director Robert Mueller, as well as the Senate Intelligence Committee, about failures to investigate terrorism, were the spark that ignited a serious look into the internal workings of the FBI. Another problem, organizational process and structure. The Challenger disaster exemplifies a number of ways that things can go tragically wrong. One of the problems was caused by the way the process was structured. Engineers did not have the final say over whether the Challenger should be launched. even though they were in the best position to assess the safety of various windows of opportunity to launch the space shuttle. In addition, they did not have a formal process to raise their concerns about safety to someone who would both understand the engineering issues and who could make a final decision. Although there were other kinds of wrongdoing in this case, it shows that it is actually possible for something bad to happen even in the absence of deliberate individual wrongdoing. If we couple a badly organized process with human wrongdoing, we have the possibility of serious catastrophes. How common are these system failures? Well, according to two prominent risk analyzers, these failures account for the vast majority of preventable errors. Another cause of group misconduct is organizational culture. Organizations have cultures, values, and ways of doing things that can either support or undermine integrity. Some organizations encourage a cowboy mentality where doing the right thing takes a back seat to personal aggrandizement. Some organizations stress secrecy and put the health of the organization above its stakeholders. Some organizations are punitive and disrespectful of the rank and file who feel powerless and resentful. All of these cultures are ripe for misconduct. Another problem is lack of oversight. For many people, the accounting scandals of the last 10 years are evidence that lax oversight is the oxygen that allows the match of greed to ignite an inferno. There is a great debate about regulation and oversight. Some have argued that we need only to let the market work. They argue that a free and open market will constrain companies from fraud, bad products and services, and inefficiency because customers will shift to the ethical, productive, and innovative companies. But even if this were so, it's not clear that this will solve our problems because we don't have completely free or open markets. Secondly, even if markets could work to root out problems, many people would suffer in the meantime. For this reason, many people are convinced that we need some regulations to constrain corporate misconduct and oversight bodies to see that the regulations are followed. Another problem is the misalignment of incentives. Sometimes organizations are trying to create ways to encourage their members to do the right thing, but their strategies misfire. Stock options are a great example here. A stock option is the ability to buy company stock at a fixed price. Say you join the Northwest Widget Company, whose stock is trading at $1. As part of your compensation package, you get 1,000 options to buy Northwest stock at $1 each. If Northwest's stock goes up to $2, you can exercise your option and buy 1,000 shares at $1 each. You can then turn around and sell them for $2,000 and realize a $1,000 profit. The initial idea behind stock options was to get managers to share the interests of shareholders. Both groups would then want the company to do well so that the stock will do well. Unfortunately, the example of Enron and others showed that often stock options don't work very well at aligning the interests of management and shareholders. When managers have large numbers of stock options, they have a reason to increase the stock price. But this can be done by increasing the value of the company or by manipulating the profit reports of the company, as happened in the case of Enron. Another cause of misconduct is the political environment. Organizations exist in a larger political context. If this larger context either supports corruption or simply looks the other way, then the organizations that exist within this political context are liable to become corrupt. We will return to this topic when we discuss justice. Another cause is globalization. Suppose we succeeded in reining in corporate misconduct in the United States. Suppose all corporations operating on our shores were models of financial propriety and shareholder responsibility, responsive to customers, fair to workers, and responsible stewards of the environment. Would we be able to rest on our laurels? Obviously not, because we live and work in a global community. While the returns on corporate responsibility are clear and convincing, they often accrue to parties outside the companies themselves. Thus, being socially responsible is often costly to companies. For example, air pollution is a cost to everyone who breathes, so clean air is a clear benefit. Companies who use processes that involve air pollutants must make investments in clean technology in order to keep the air clean. But this technology is not free. While it is true that investments in cleaner technology often result in saving money for the companies using it, it is often a cost, at least in the short run. What happens then is that companies that are required to use such technology will make the investment, while companies that are not required to do so will not. The companies that do not shoulder this additional cost can sell their products at a lower cost, thus crowding out the cleaner products. This is what happens when one country or group of countries sets a standard for corporate conduct, while other countries or regions set the bar at a lower level. We've talked about causes. Let's now talk about cures. The first is a renewed emphasis on integrity. Yes, there are bad apples. People whose greed and self-importance makes them insensitive to the demands of morality. The cure for these bad apples is punishment inflicted promptly and fairly. But if you look at the law in the United States, you will see that the more common legal response to corporate misconduct is either administrative or civil sanctions. Many have argued that prison would be both more effective and more fair. White-collar crime is far more costly than street crime, but someone who commits a street crime is treated much more harshly by the criminal justice system. This is both unfair and inefficient. But we hope we've convinced you that the person who remains in blissful ignorance or simply goes along is both more common and, because they are more common, more of a problem. Punishing bad apples promptly and fairly will go a long way towards strengthening the backbones of these people as well. The rest of the work must be done by social pressure and individual conscience. We think that forgiveness is a virtue, though, like all virtues, it's possible to be too forgiving or forgiving at the wrong time and in the wrong way. Perhaps this has been the case for white-collar crime. Though it's often difficult to see the harm, the cost is enormous. In the WorldCom case, over $3 billion disappeared, and that money belonged to someone, to the employees, customers, vendors, and shareholders. In addition to the stick approach, we also need to make it easier for people to do the right thing. One way we can help people to stand up and resist corporate misconduct is by protecting whistleblowers. Leadership with integrity and personal responsibility is another cure. If weak or misguided leadership causes or allows misconduct, leadership based on integrity, communication, and personal responsibility is the cure. We can all be like Cynthia Cooper, Sharon Watkins, and Colleen Rowley. One way we can encourage more personal responsibility and leadership is by building it into our organizations. Whistleblower protection, evaluations that focus on personal integrity and responsibility and not just the bottom line. Another cure is what I call moral risk management. If faulty processes are badly designed systems and they are responsible for a majority of avoidable errors, then the solution is obvious. Design and test systems with the express goal of avoiding harm. Since it is impossible to design perfect systems or processes, make sure that there is a reporting system that empowers users and designers to report problems. Another cure: ethical cultures and ethical organizations. Ethical organizations reward integrity and discourage wrongdoing. They have an explicit set of values, and these values permeate the organization. The tone is set at the top, and the members of the organization incorporate these values in their day-to-day activities. They understand their responsibilities to their stakeholders, and they develop practices that are attentive to these responsibilities. The members feel trusted and valued, and they bring a sense of commitment to their activities on behalf of the organization. Another cure is meaningful oversight. Regulation and oversight are part of the recipe for minimizing organizational misconduct, but we must be careful to manage efficiency and fairness along with our desire to prevent wrongdoing. Many of us have had the misfortune of being blamed for the wrongdoing of others. Being constantly treated as a possible criminal is demoralizing and ultimately undermines the very trust and commitment we need to help people to do the right thing. Arriving at the right balance is something that we need to work very hard at, and it is a task that is never finished. Another cure is to realign incentives. There are many ways to provide incentives for doing the right thing and disincentives for doing the wrong thing. The first thing to do is to have such incentives and disincentives in place. For example, let's return to our example of stock options. Here we see a range of solutions that have been offered. The two goals of reform are aligning the interests of stockholders and managers and minimizing the role of stock options as a temptation for misconduct. One might give options only when a company outperforms its competitors, thus reducing the payoff for managers who merely rode an industry wave to success. We could require that stock options be held for a longer period of time, thus minimizing the push towards short-term over long-term gain. We could put limits on the amount of compensation given as stock options. We could abolish stock options altogether. Expensing stock options is a related strategy whose principal aim is to give shareholders a clearer picture of the corporation's finances. Because stockholders would be able to see the real cost of the options, it might also have the effect of limiting the number of options that are issued. Another cure is the political environment. Since organizations operate within a larger economic, social, and political context, we can't expect morally responsible organizations unless we can create and sustain just social institutions. Since the question of what counts as a just institution is such a big one, we will devote a week later in this class to that question. If globalization is the problem, how can it be the cure? If the primary problem of globalization is that we do not have a level playing field for scrupulous and unscrupulous organizations, the ultimate solution is to have international agreements suitably enforced, guaranteeing that organizations cannot benefit from corporate misconduct. Obviously, this is not something that can happen overnight, but it is certainly something to strive for.